Chicago, 1924. The city was alive with contradictions. Jazz spilled out of smoky nightclubs, skyscrapers pierced the skyline, and fortunes were made overnight. But in the shadows lurked gangsters like Al Capone, and a culture that thrived on risk, excess, and arrogance. Amid this world of glitz and crime, another story unfolded, not of mobsters, but of two privileged young men who dared to play God. A story not of love or revenge, but of philosophy twisted into horror. This would be called the crime of the century. Before he became a headline, Bobby Franks was simply a boy. 14 years old, bright-eyed, a student at the Harvard School for Boys. He loved tennis, baseball, and the comforts of his wealthy Kenwood neighborhood. On May 21, 1924, Bobby was walking home after a game of baseball when he encountered two older boys he trusted, Nathan, Leopold and Richard Loeb. One was his cousin. In an instant, Bobby's fate was sealed. His life, full of promise, would be extinguished for nothing more than an experiment in arrogance. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were not ordinary young men. They were prodigies. Leopold, with an IQ over 200, spoke 9 languages, studied at the University of Chicago, and was a celebrated ornithologist. Loeb, charming and confident, was the youngest graduate in the history of the University of Michigan. Wealth, intelligence, privilege, they had it all. But beneath the surface lay broken souls. Leopold, awkward and insecure, clung obsessively to Loeb. Loeb, handsome and manipulative, craved thrills and control. Together, they misinterpreted Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, believing their superiority placed them above morality, above law, above humanity itself. And so, they planned a crime not for money, not for hate, but for the thrill of being untouchable. For 7 months, they plotted, every detail designed with surgical precision. A kidnapping disguised as a ransom scheme, a rented Willie's night car under a false name, a chisel for the kill, hydrochloric acid to disfigure the victim. They typed a ransom note full of riddles and instructions to outsmart the police. On May 21st, the plan came alive. Loeb lured Bobby Franks into the car with talk of a new tennis racket. Within minutes, Bobby was struck with the chisel, a rag shoved into his mouth. He died in terror and confusion at the hands of his own cousin and his cousin's companion. Coldly, they drove to a marshland south of Chicago, stripped him, doused his body with acid, and shoved him into a drainage culvert. To them, Bobby was nothing more than a pawn in their philosophical experiment. The perfect crime collapsed with a single careless error. As they dragged Bobby's body into the culvert, Leopold's eyeglasses slipped from his pocket. They were no ordinary glasses. The hinge design was rare, only 3 pairs in Chicago. When Bobby's body was found the next morning by a worker, the glasses were found too. Within days, detectives traced them to Leopold. His arrogant explanations crumbled. The chauffeur contradicted his alibi. Soon, Loeb broke. Then Leopold, each blamed the other for the murder. Their intellectual superiority had betrayed them with the simplest of oversights. Chicago was riveted. The media called them thrill killers. Public opinion demanded death by hanging. The Franks family, shattered, demanded justice, but their wealthy parents hired Clarence Darrow, America's most famous defense attorney and a fierce opponent of the death penalty. Darrow orchestrated a guilty plea not to excuse the crime, but to remove the case from a jury. For 12 hours across 2 scorching days, Darrow pleaded with Judge John Caverly. He did not argue innocence. He argued mercy. He painted Leopold and Loeb as broken products of privilege, mental illness, and obsession. His words echoed through history. Mercy is the highest attribute of man. Against all odds, it worked. Judge Caverly spared them the noose, sentencing them to life in prison plus 99 years. Chicago gasped, justice or mercy? The nation was split. Richard Loeb never lived long. In 1936, he was slashed to death by a fellow inmate with a razor blade. Nathan Leopold survived, transforming into a model prisoner, teaching, studying, even volunteering in dangerous medical experiments. He was paroled in 1958, moved to Puerto Rico, married, and lived quietly until his death in 1971. But the case of Leopold and Loeb lived on. It forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. Should intellect excuse crime? Can psychology mitigate evil? Was Darrow right about mercy? For all the philosophy and debate, one truth remains. A boy named Bobby Franks lost his life not for money, not for vengeance, but for arrogance. His story reminds us that intelligence without empathy is not brilliance, it is monstrosity.